Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Global Hotspots podcast. I'm your host for today, Miraj Majore, and I'll be talking to my colleagues Andrew Loftus-Ness, Jared Jeter, and Sebastian Ditkin about some of the main developments from the previous quarter related to our geopolitical hotspots, as well as the implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. As always, you can find a more in-depth analysis and forecast of these topics in our newly released Q3 quarterly report. You can find an executive summary at newlinesinstitute.org or get the full report once you register to our geopolitical forecasting platform. Now, on a previous episode, we covered the developments throughout this quarter and the next related to our main hotspots, the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific, and the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But now we wanted to take the time to turn our attention in this episode to some of the developments that we've covered throughout the quarter across the world. And during Q2, we saw no shortages of such developments, namely across Latin America and Africa, including security destabilization in Sudan, political tensions in Bolivia, and continued destabilization in the Democratic Republic of Congo, to name but a few. Sebastian, I wanted to bring you in here to start with. So, looking at Bolivia. Now, this is something that seemingly popped up more towards the end of the second quarter. We saw a significant increase in destabilization between the citizens of Bolivia and the government. What can you tell us in terms of what actually has been happening there in country?
Yeah, so in the last quarter, Bolivia has experienced, as you said, some significant destabilization. This is all rooted in the president, Rodrigo Paz, whose government had a national victory in executive power. However, they failed to win control over regional and local governments, and we've been seeing these widespread road blockages, protests on the streets, and almost like a standstill, both politically and economically. And candidates that were affiliated with the former ruler Evo Morales, his party, the Movement for Socialism, or MAS, and Santa Cruz Civic Committee. They started coalitions pushing for decentralization and regional economic management. However, it's been in a gridlock with Paz's government, which is from the other party. Meanwhile, this anti-government unrest has widened, and these are due to grievances over the removal of fuel subsidies and other government austerity measures. And there's been a national blockade led by labor unions and supporters of the former socialist president I mentioned, Evo Morales. So President Paz's push to enable emergency powers and military road clearing will likely make Q3 a little bit more confrontational. But at this moment, his government is likely to remain in power, but more like in a lame duck situation, as there will be complete standstills. And now this kind of draws into a larger discussion of these IMF austerity measures, which have been used in the past, especially around the global south, to aid countries during economic hardship. However, in these cases here, where it leads to more economic downturn and at this point really stagnation, we wonder whether countries like Bolivia will be looking to other sources of economic aid, namely whether it's China or maybe through the GCC wealth funds or other measures there. So it's an interesting crossroads here where we might see changes in how Bolivia approaches their economic downturn at the moment.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see. One thing that I thought was notable was the fact that Paz's government is the first right-wing government in quite a while to assume power, national power of the country, and seemingly the economic policies, as you mentioned, the austerity, the removal of fuel subsidies, have been the main cause for this unrest and this destabilization. And then the Evo Morales link is quite interesting. That's certainly something that's pushed quite heavily by the government. Paz very much trying to make the link between the protests and, that internal that internal security destabilization as it relates to even armed groups and potential domestic terrorism. Now, obviously, Morales denies that, and I should say that he is currently in hiding due to charges related to alleged human trafficking, charges that he denies. Yeah, as you mentioned, we are sitting at a crossroads, and it could go either way. But where do you think it's likely to go within Q3? Do you think we're going to see more of this destabilization? Do you think the protests and the military mobilizations are likely to continue, or do you think we'll eventually see a bit of a dwindling down of that?
Paz's government was really coming in at a place where Evo Morales' party was failing to fulfill all the promises of this almost utopian dream of Farmers' Republic, this left-wing push here. And when that failed, there was this new vacuum that was filled by Paz's party. However, when even this new ideology was showing cracks and the economy was not able to bounce back, the people, whether it's left or right, were they're now unified in a distrust of the current order, whether it's the IMF-backed subsidies, the fuel shortages, and all the grievances here. Is no longer a left or right issue or a party issue, but more of a distrust in the government as a whole. So I don't think this gets cleared up through legislation at the moment, and obviously I'm not saying that this is going to be a complete dissolution of states here, but this sort of gridlock that we're faced is something that will continue throughout Q3.
Yeah, definitely Bolivia emerging as a notable regional flashpoint in Q3. So we'll be asking you to come in with any likely updates throughout the quarter. And to our listeners, if you're wondering whether we are covering any other Latin American countries, yes, we are. We routinely cover Venezuela, as well as developments in Cuba, which we covered in our first episode with regards to the US and its relations with the broader Americas. I wanted to shift now to the African continent, and we've been covering a lot there. And there's been some regular occurrences, namely Sudan and the DRC. But I wanted to start with a largely newer area of coverage that we've incorporated in our quarterly reports, namely Morocco. And there's been some unrest kind of building over the past of the past quarter. So I wanted to get your sense here again, Sebastian, in terms of what has been going on there and what you see as likely going forward.
Morocco is dealing with parliamentary elections upcoming in September 23rd of this year. So there have been large-scale unrest starting in 2025, really rooted in Gen Z, in a movement called Gen Z 212. And this has been a decentralized push from all sectors of life who have seen disenfranchisement in policy, in economic outcomes and prospects, and have turned their ire towards the government, especially parliaments who they've seen as slow to enact requests that the movement has made, namely better access to employment, to more access in governance and civic participation as well. Now, in the upcoming election here, I don't believe that these protests or this unrest will spark something huge or like a huge flashpoint directly tied to the election itself. However, in this very fraught situation where there are many potential triggers that might cause large-scale protest, we have to keep a close eye on this, whether this is maybe violence that gets started in one of the protests, or maybe a bill that is passed as unsavory. in the movements. So just keeping our eye out on this and seeing whether it will be contained and controlled, and maybe there will be some collaboration, or at least some concessions made by the government. It will be interesting to look at. One other thing to point out is that this election here will test whether the monarchy can stay insulated from the public's attention. For much of the last year, these protests were not directed at the monarchy. It was really directed at the parliamentary government. But in this situation, if tensions were to rise higher, we might see some of this being turned towards the monarchy.
Yeah, thank you, Sebastian. Another thing that I think is very important to mention with Morocco specifically is the way that these protests and the way that this growing instability has also affected the lives of the people in Western Sahara. The formerly proclaimed Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic and its citizens, of course, have been more forcibly integrated within the Moroccan system, and there's been quite a lot of controversy around both the voting rights and how much the Moroccan government is instituting certain policies that might attempt to suppress or subvert the votes of the people down there, which are much more oppositional to the Moroccan government as a whole. And it's just worth just pointing out and keeping aware that a lot of people, particularly in the south of the country, are part of the newly integrated and forcibly integrated territories, and they have quite a few grievances bubbling up in addition to the regular protest within Morocco.
Indeed. So there's these flashpoints. You mentioned Western Sahara, and also the upcoming World Cup in 4 years. A lot of investments have been made into that, and many, especially younger people, believe that this is money that could have been spent on whether it's public infrastructure or public funds. So that's something worth keeping in mind. Thank you, Jared.
I wanted to turn now to some of the other hotspots we've been covering, and as I mentioned, Sudan was one of those that routinely featured on our coverage this quarter. It's been going on for a large number of years now, but this week, or this quarter, I should say, we've seen some various developments, including from the international side, with Sudan more and more reportedly getting various international players, whether it be Ethiopia, the UAE, or even in one case, Colombia, I believe, assisting the RSF. So lots to cover there. Again, turning back to you, Sebastian, here, give us a sense of how you perceive the changing landscape in Sudan.
Yeah, so there's been increased drone warfare happening across the country, across the conflict, leading to some low security destabilization. And this is due to Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, having drone strikes that are reaching Port Sudan, not necessarily starting in this quarter, but heightened in this quarter of Q2. And this has changed the way it's fought because SAF, the Sudanese armed forces, on the other hand, are also able to reach deep into Darfur and RSF-held territory. This, of course, is being aided by many regional actors, and whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's Russia, Iran, and more and more so, Ethiopia has helped the RSF. One other point here is just the importance of Port Sudan and the Red Sea. So Port Sudan sits right on the Red Sea and is Sudan's main access to the ocean and trade. So having this be the focal point, whereas for a large part of the early parts of the war, the port was relatively safe from attacks, but now we see this as a contentious point, as both sides see the port as paramount to controlling the outcomes of the war going forward. So we'll keep a close eye out on Q3 as this port has been seeing extra attention from both sides, and we will keep you updated.
Yeah, Sebastian, thanks for that overview. The one thing I would add that we should keep our eye on is the RSF position and intentions around El Obeid right now. It's looking to be like a repeat of the atrocities that we saw in El Fasher. presently, the international community does not seem to be prepared to intervene in a meaningful way. Of course, we wouldn't expect that either, just having observed this conflict carry on in that manner for so long now. But I do think that is, and there's a number of things that we could talk about there, but relevant to this specific episode, I do think that is an indication of the toleration that the international community still has for continued escalation inside Sudan.
Yeah, Andrew, that's a good point. I just wanted to chime in here that the RSF, even though their supply lines have changed over the last year due to restrictions in the flow of arms, they have still committed many attacks on the population in Darfur, the civilian population, through guerrilla attacks and more improvisational and opportunistic means. And this is something to keep an eye on as we continue in Q3, because despite maybe less international attention at the moment, it is something that is still waging quite heavily.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll have to keep an eye on that international component as well. As you mentioned, Andrew, it looks like the international community is not really set to intervene at the moment. But what we may see is ever increasing allegations, at least, if not revelations of international aid with regards to the RSF forces. So all things that we're going to keep a lookout for. And speaking of, there is a certain link to be made with one of Sudan's neighboring country, namely Ethiopia. Here as well, there's been some escalationary links with regards to Sudan, which I think we can talk about, but also some interesting destabilization aspects throughout Q2 on the domestic front. And we've previously covered this in an episode with our other analyst, Bethlehem, but wanted to jump back in here with the Ethiopia situation, just to give an overview from the quarter. So perhaps starting as a segue from the Sudan side of things, what is Ethiopia's link to that conflict specifically?
Yes, so Ethiopia has experienced quite some destabilization, and it's headed in a direction that looks like it will lead to potentially war in Tigray, between Ethiopia, Tigray, and Eritrea. And the link here is access to the sea. With the Red Sea and Ethiopia being the largest country in the world in terms of population without access to a coastline. Ethiopia has tried for many years to find a sustainable method to access sea shipping. Now, currently, around 90 to 95% of their shipping from the sea comes from Djibouti. In the past, they've tried access through Somaliland, which was contentious with Somalia as well as with Egypt, both of whom saw this as infringing on sovereignty of the Somalian state. Yet now, as a result, President Abiy of Ethiopia has turned to Eritrea as a potential avenue to getting port access. This, of course, does not bode well with Eritrea, who sees this as a breach of sovereignty and will defend this tooth and nail. Now, there are the other big update in Q2 was that Prime Minister Abiy had another dominant electoral victory, and this was despite voting being suppressed in regions of Amhara, Oromia, and Tigray, which are regions where factions have disrupted and challenged federal authority due to pushes for independence or autonomy. Regionally, this has been exacerbated by Eritrea, who has fueled Tigrayan independence claims or pushes for independence, and this has heightened these tensions. Meanwhile, there has been increased movement in the proxy corridor with Sudan, where the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, has supported the SAF in Sudan, while the Abiy government in Ethiopia has supported the RSF and has trained troops for Sudan in Ethiopian territory. So keeping all this in mind, it is really a tense boiling pot right now, and to keep an eye out to see if the escalation will spill into all-out conflict is something to keep an eye out on in Q3.
All-out conflict in what way do you mean?
So there was already some clashes between the TPLF, the Tigray coalition there, as well as with the Abiy government's forces in the beginning of Q2. And this was a small-scale clash, but it's an example of what might spill into more conflict between Tigray and Ethiopia. And it's been precipitated by massive displacements in Tigray as civilians are looking for safety, and a lot of antagonistic rhetoric on both sides from the Tigrayan front as well as Addis.
Gotcha. Thanks, Sebastian. So yeah, quite an international or quite an interesting mix between that international spillover, but also that domestic boiling pot that you mentioned that we'll have to keep some tabs on going into the rest of the year and specifically next quarter. I wanted to briefly just give an update on the Democratic Republic of Congo, where going into Q3, we will likely see a continuation of a low destabilization scenario. Now, throughout the past quarter, there was a mix of international pressure, including sanctions that were targeting Rwanda, as well as the M23 rebel group and its linked actors, alongside ongoing peace negotiations, which compelled the group, M23, to make territorial concessions throughout Q2. Now, that being said, it did retain control of some key military and economic strongholds. Despite all of this, neither side, neither the rebel groups nor the government-backed forces, have demonstrated a willingness to accept a political settlement. Instead, the conflict is looking to enter a new phase, which is characterized, as with Sudan, as with many places it seems, with the expanded use of drones. And recent M23 strikes on military targets in Kisangani, hundreds of miles from the front lines, demonstrate that increasing ability by M23 to project force deep into enemy territory. Now, this shift will likely increase risks to civilians, as well as the critical infrastructure of the country, whilst still allowing both sides to pursue military objectives without launching major territorial offensives. And all of this means that the conflict is likely going to be prolonged despite the ongoing diplomatic engagement.
Yeah, thanks, Milosh. I just wanted to add here that this is very new for the DRC. Kisangani, as you mentioned, is very far away from the Kivu region where the fighting has happened. However, government forces have had air base in Kisangani, and for the first time in the conflict, drones have been used to attack other points that are outside of what was previously a relatively localized theater here. Now, with any drone warfare, what you get is collateral on civilians. You get also less expenditure from the attacking side, in that you don't need to bring troops into certain regions to create presence, right? And as a result, we might find, whereas before you might see a lot of the fighting localized to just the front lines here, now we're spilled over, and it's really tough, especially when in the previous few years there's been local displacements where when the fighting has come towards a road network or a village, the civilians in a village would move over to an area that was safer, but now it's harder to predict where these next safe points might be.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's likely that at least there is some spillover going on from the Ukraine war, insofar as that really has been a testing ground for the past couple of years for the use of drones, and it's likely that people within the DRC have kept tabs on it and are drawing their own conclusions as to the effectiveness and viability of such tactics. We have covered a lot, and there is so much that we could still cover throughout the world, but we wanted to close it off just by giving a quick brief on the Sahel region as a whole, including Nigeria, including Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Bringing you in here one last time, Sebastian, could you give us a sense of the region, what's been going on in Q2, and where we're likely to go next in Q3?
Yeah, so there's this continued destabilization in the region. The Alliance of Sahel states, including Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, have found that it's been harder and harder to contain these transnational militant forces, including the Al-Qaeda-linked Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin, known as JNIM, or other actors in the region, including ISWAP, which is ISIS West Africa Province, and it has completely undermined state authority in rural areas and has been encroaching on the peripheries of cities. Now, at this current status quo, the juntas in control of the three Sahel states have been unable to slow down the continued progression of these groups. And these, even though there's been some counterterrorism successes conducted unilaterally by the U.S., there has been a lack of a solution that seems to be cohesive in stopping this encroachment. Now, Russia's Africa course has remained focused on regime protection for these three states. However, there's been increased attention in U.S. reapproachment and coming back into this sphere in terms of providing ISR, other sort of military support in the name of counterterrorism. So U.S. envoy Nick Checker has visited these three Sahel states in the beginning of Q2, and we'll look in Q3 to see whether the U.S. will heighten involvement to some capacity, especially in counterterrorism, if not in these three states, at least in the periphery of the Sahel in Nigeria and potentially Benin.
Yeah, and concomitantly, if Russia's Africa Corps, as you mentioned, whether it decides to stay there or whether the Russian government decides that its usage could be better put into place, perhaps in Ukraine, perhaps in other fronts. So all of that we have to still see throughout Q3. And I think with that, we're going to wrap it up for today. And as a reminder to our listeners, if you'd like a more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to all of the topics we talked about today, please check out our Q3 forecast report on our website at newlinesinstitute.org, where you can also register to receive our weekly newsletter, as well as access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for regular updates around the world. And please go and check out episode 1 of our Q3 forecast podcast series, where we talked about the 3 main global hotspots. So thank you, Sebastian, Andrew, and Jared, for joining me. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Take care.